The question I get from a lot of people is this narcissism thing new? Well, obviously not. An entire religious system and a few popes and other religious scholars saw it fit to write their system of sins around the exact characteristics that comprise narcissism. Lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, rage, arrogance, vindictiveness, envy, covetousness, greed. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism. And what better place to talk about the 7 deadly sins? Be curious if any of you know them by heart. I didn't. I had to do a big research on this to figure out what the 7 deadly sins were. So let's talk about them. So this video idea kind of came up when I was sort of stuck in an airport and then my flight was delayed and then I was daydreaming and started thinking about the 7 deadly sins. Then I started reading about them. Now the 7 deadly sins were originally laid out in the Catholic religious canon, but have sort of entered all Western thought. So again, I studied them. And it turns out that historically, these 7 deadly sins are viewed as sort of predispositions for bad behavior. But I have to say, as I read about the 7 deadly sins, I felt like I was reading about a 1,500 to 2,000-year-old description of narcissism. So let's take a tour of these because it's really quite striking. The 7 deadly sins almost reads like an ancient DSM. Okay, so if you want to play along, I want you to think about the key narcissistic relationships in your life. And as I say each sin, check off the ones that this person has. I wouldn't be surprised if they have all 7. So the first deadly sin is pride. A read on what they meant by pride is that in this taxonomy is that pride was arrogance and is sort of the mothership of all other sins. It's hubris. And you can imagine that religious folks didn't like that because a person who had pride thought they were above the rules and they really liked rules back then. Now, when we think about this in the context of narcissism, pride is everything, right? It may be one of the key governing qualities, this idea of arrogance and also entitlement, that the rules don't apply to them, that they are somehow above everything. The counterweight, or if you will, the opposite to pride, is humility. And ironically, humility is a key element of agreeableness, which is the opposite of antagonism. The second deadly sin is greed or covetousness. The sort of religious framing around this is coveting or taking more than what you need, right? Greedy people covet stuff and they want what other people have. For greedy people, no matter how much they get, it's never enough. Now, greed is a central core issue of narcissism. Narcissistic people are covetous, competitive, and they don't like not being in power, and stuff and money and all the rest of it are a source of that power. And that greed never really dissipates for narcissistic people. The third deadly sin is lust. It's sort of the sex addiction of the 5th century. Lust is consistent with this idea of unfettered desire. And it kind of overlaps with covetousness because lust, in this definition of a sin, is giving in to your desire or want anytime you want it. The belief was that people who had lust were more likely to engage in behaviors that way back then were considered immoral. Now, if we were to take this idea of lust into modern times, we would see that lust lays the groundwork for what we call dysregulated sexual behavior, regardless of how it affects other people. Back in the day, lust was considered to not be as serious a sin as something like pride. But when we connect it to narcissism, it sort of tracks, right? Narcissism is correlated with obsessive, dysregulated sexual behavior, and narcissism is also associated with sex addiction. Like I said, which it seems like what they were talking about when they were talking about lust in the 5th century, they were kind of talking about sex addiction. The 4th deadly sin is envy. And the grand irony here is that envy is actually part of the modern DSM criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Now, envy builds onto greed, covetousness, and lust. It's not just the wanting. It's the wanting what someone else has. Social media, right? Interestingly, ancient conceptions of envy talk about various steps in the process of envy, such as harming the reputation of the person who has what you want. Then it is about schadenfreude, or being happy when something bad happens to the person that you envy. Narcissistic people not only envy other people, but they often believe that other people envy them. So envy is a guiding construct of narcissism. The fifth deadly sin is gluttony. This is a deadly sin that's related to overconsumption. This sin typically was talking about food, and the implication was that by a person overeating, that meant someone else was lacking. Someone was eating more food than one needed, another person was going hungry. And keep in mind, these sins were written at a time of far greater food scarcity. But again, you can see a theme here. Gluttony also takes in the territory such as covetousness, greed, and lust. And it has a sort of lack of empathy built in, a person eating and eating when others are hungry. It's sort of an obsessiveness about food and food experiences. Like nowadays it would be like, I have to go to the fancy restaurant kind of thing. Now, while gluttony in and of itself, I don't think it's an indicator of narcissism, unrepentant appetites for whatever the narcissistic person wants is very much a part of gluttony. And in some ways, the modern take on gluttony is the need to be at the hot new restaurant, eating the best new thing, and of course, posting about it. It's more of the wanting more and needing more and having better than what other people are consuming and doing it without reflection on whether others are having enough. So it's sort of overconsumption meets lack of empathy. That's sort of what gluttony is. The sixth deadly sin is sloth. Now here is where it gets really interesting. These deadly sin people were really onto something, because sloth is where the concept of vulnerable narcissism actually gets captured really well. I traditionally thought of sloth as laziness. And while that is part of it, apparently it's way more. It's sort of an apathy, lack of empathy, limited range of emotion, lack of motivation, only caring for the self and not anybody else. Slothy people are sort of negligent, late, and sort of chronically victimized. It's freaking vulnerable narcissism. It was amazing. As I read this, I was like, what? This means that folks back then were observing this phenomenon. There were these sullen, petulant, passive-aggressive folks that were walking around at that time, and they called it sloth. And obviously the churchy folks believed strongly in a work ethic, and folks who don't work hard were considered sort of sinner-ish. But this sloth thing really captures all the apathetic, victimized, and aggrieved stuff that comprises vulnerable narcissism. This sense that they cannot be bothered to do anything good. And the seventh and final deadly sin is wrath. Wrath is not just anger. It's also vindictiveness. It's a really interesting framing, because the deadly sin people actually weren't mad about anger. What they were saying that anger becomes a sin when the target of the anger is an innocent person, when that anger is disproportionate, when that anger is punitive, and that anger is unrelenting. Sound familiar? It's exactly the kind of anger we witness in narcissism, which is reactive, vengeance-oriented, punitive, and never seems to abate. There's that shame-rage spiral. So yes, the 7 deadly sins did come out of a religious canon, of a religious structure. And a lot of these sins are about people being unrestrained. The words we psychology folks use is dysregulated. And certainly, one could make the argument that the 7 deadly sins were a form of social control, that a person who lived outside the lines would be branded a sinner. But when you dive deeper into what was written about these sins, folks like Thomas Aquinas and folks like this wrote about it. It wasn't healthy pride, but arrogance. It wasn't eating good food. It was feasting. while others were starving. So, okay, back to modern 2023 times. What does this tell us? Because the question I get from a lot of people is this narcissism thing new? Well, obviously not. An entire religious system and a few popes and other religious scholars saw it fit to write their system of sins around the exact characteristics that comprise narcissism. Lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, rage, arrogance, vindictiveness, envy, covetousness, greed. I actually thought vanity was a deadly sin. I gave myself a quiz and I said vanity, but apparently it's a more minor sin. But it's all there, which means historically, human beings have seen this as a problem. But we never really figured it out. I guess back then, they thought people might get the sins punished out of them. We know that that's not true. But what we did know, always knew, is that it's not good for us. And it never will be. Hold on to your hats, because we're going to be doing a video coming up on the 7 sacred virtues. And those are going to teach you and help you see the qualities that really line up with who gets the most hurt by the narcissistic folks. So no. Let's talk now. We talked about the deadly sins. Let's talk about the 7 sacred virtues. So we talked about the deadly sins, and they clearly describe narcissism. So that begs the question, and you know I went on this deep dive, do the 7 sacred virtues describe the nice people who get stuck in these relationships? A little, yeah, they do. Actually, more than a little. It's not as perfect a map as the deadly sins are to narcissism. And in part, that's because people with different kinds of personalities end up in narcissistic relationships. But what is interesting is that each of the 7 virtues represents a sort of counterweight or an opposite to each sin. So let's take them on in that same way. So the first sacred virtue is humility. This is the counterweight to the sin of pride. In personality theory, humility is often part of the larger trait of agreeableness. Humility is not just being humble, but it has varying ancient definitions, including what we would consider now to be authenticity. Seeing clearly and knowing who you are, knowing your strengths and weaknesses. Humility is also about freedom from ego, the willingness to acknowledge the gifts of others, and in a more extreme telling, humility can also be about submission. So humility is a tricky concept. There's lots of moving parts, but many, if not most survivors I have encountered have had a lot of humility. However, that submission part, the subjugation and giving in, even to those who may be harmful, that's the harmful part of humility for a person in a narcissistic relationship. However, if we see this through the point of view of a giving up of ego and seeing oneself and seeing others clearly, this is most survivors of narcissistic relationships. And there's also a vulnerability that's created by humility because there may also be a greater risk of subjugation. The second sacred virtue is charity, which is the opposite of the deadly sin of greed. Charity was originally conceived of as love of God and other people. It is the giving of oneself to others and is actually considered the supreme of all virtues because it most parallels what we witness in divinity, and it represents the divine in ourselves. This isn't just about giving money to charity or doing nice things. It's about being good to other people. So again, this virtue, you can see how it gets people stuck in narcissistic relationships. The charity means that you keep loving the person even as they are harming you or giving more and more of yourself to a person who's not caring for you. People who possess this trait of charity, it's pretty clear that they will quite easily get sucked into the vortex of narcissistic relationships. This charity quality is a wonderful quality, and again, like humility, is part of the model of agreeableness that is often present in people who are most harmed by narcissistic relationships. The third sacred virtue is chastity, which is the offset to the sin of lust. Now, of all of the virtues, This one was the most tricky to me because it was sort of a pathologizing of sex outside of marriage and everything that was sex or sex adjacent, like masturbation. I don't know that it's a virtue to not have sex, right? Broadly, chastity is temperance. I can understand that a bit more. Temperance is the managing of one's appetites, which really means regulation. But I don't know that this level of constraint is ever a good thing. So suffice it to say, I'm not a chastity fan, and that this particular virtue doesn't map well into the world of understanding survivors of narcissistic relationships, except that it is not unusual for people in narcissistic relationships to be shamed about their sexuality. Families may shame them, especially if it's a family system characterized by self-righteous and intrusive narcissists, and narcissistic partners may shame a partner about sex or sexuality as a means of control. This is less about the chastity being a good thing, as sexuality being one more place that narcissistic people use to engage in shaming. The fourth sacred virtue is kindness, and that's a counterweight to the sin of envy. And tell me kindness isn't most survivors of these relationships. Kindness is great. I love kindness, right? It's the best. It's a core pillar of empathy for other people. Kindness builds pro-social relationships. And narcissistic people kind of run roughshod over kind people because the kind person will rather seamlessly make excuses and justifications, not because the kind person is foolish, but because they are often trying to understand the narcissistic person. In many ways, genuine kindness can be seen as the opposite of narcissism. Kind people who are happy for others who are succeeding and don't envy them, don't feel chronically competitive. Again, kindness could really be viewed in this model as the opposite of narcissism. The fifth virtue is temperance, which is the opposite to the sin of gluttony. And in a modern world, again, a bit like that chastity bit, it can be viewed as regulation and impulse control. Things that fall under temperance could include things like modesty, behaving in an appropriate way, being forgiving. Where gluttony is all about being dysregulated and not caring if other people are covered, temperance is about being really, really regulated. And one thing we know about many, not all, but many folks who are healing from and managing narcissistic relationships is that, in fact, what I've seen in most survivors is that they are over-regulated, not even sharing emotions. The restraint of temperance can mean giving lots of second chances and being very forgiving, which we know is a real monkey on the back of survivors, because forgiving a narcissistic person means you will get burned again. The sixth sacred virtue is diligence, and it is the opposite of the sin of sloth. Again, sloth is not just laziness, and diligence is not just getting things done. Diligence is about doing the right thing over and over again. So it's the doing, not always doing just because it's going to be rewarded, but simply because it is the right thing to do. In other world religions like Hinduism, diligence would be considered to be similar to what we call dharma. It's not doing something. Dharma is doing the right thing. It's not doing the thing to get credit or some good outcome, but rather doing the thing because it's good to do it. Again, this is very opposite of what we see in narcissism. People with narcissistic personalities do things to get rewarded, to get supply, to get admiration. Having this so-called virtue of diligence can get you stuck because you keep doing the right thing, and the right thing is never going to come back at you ever. Your life can feel like one big sucker bet if you are in a narcissistic relationship. Now, the virtue folks would argue, that's okay, keep doing it. The shrink brigade right here would say, not so much. But to keep doing the right thing within a given relationship and for there to be no mutuality or reciprocity is not healthy for you in the long term. But again, this virtue of diligence is one more that would get you harmed in a narcissistic relationship. And the seventh and final sacred virtue is patience, which is considered to be the opposite of the sin of wrath. Now, this is a tricky virtue because patience, as it's written in the canon of the virtues, is about endurance, about facing forward with kindness even when it's difficult, not facing down evil with evil. Patience is about not being reactive, about being calm when you're frustrated. But really, patience is about endurance, even when things are difficult. It's about not reacting angrily when things are not going your way. And again, tell me this isn't most folks stuck in narcissistic relationships. The rule of these relationships is that the narcissistic person gets to be dysregulated and rageful. And if we show even a drop of emotion or reaction, then we are gaslighted and called out as being too sensitive or emotional. This virtue of patience is often observed in long-term survivors of any form of narcissistic relationship. Folks who endure the imbalanced, asymmetric, and unfair territory of a narcissistic relationship or system. That's really where this patience thing is an issue. So with the exception of chastity, I'm not a fan, the virtues actually clearly describe the qualities that many survivors of narcissistic relationships have or experience. These virtues are, in general, pretty wonderful qualities: regulation, patience, doing the right thing, authenticity, kindness, humility. Most of these map onto the modern personality trait of agreeableness. The very people who are most likely to get stuck in narcissistic relationships make excuses and justifications, generate rationalizations, and basically endure a rather awful relationship with the narcissistic person with grace. The virtues are wonderful when they are met and received in a loving way. But for a person in a narcissistic relationship, these so-called virtues can be played on and create a playing field that only serves the narcissistic person. In general, the sins tend to beat out, sadly, the virtues, because the sins tend to be louder and more abusive. Again, because these virtues are religious in origin, they are often embedded in this idea of devotion and piety. But if we can lift them out of a religious tradition and see these qualities more clearly in a different way, the 7 deadly sins read as antagonism and narcissism, and the 7 sacred virtues read as agreeableness. So while Scripture was never really meant to be a personality assessment or taxonomy, clearly there has been a multi-thousand-year historic awareness of what is good in relationships and what isn't. Take the religious stuff out and you can see that this stuff is timeless. If you are in possession of these virtues, find people who are the deserving recipients of all of your goodness, and use knowledge about narcissism to protect yourself, since it is natural that you will end up being taken advantage of by them. Many of you have probably heard of a very famous researcher in marriage circles, a guy named John Gottman, incredibly impressive scientist, scholar, has applied his work to doing couples therapy. And it really, so it's very sort of humbling body of work he's created. One of the big theories that came out of, or one of the big sort of takeaways from Gottman's work, is this idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So if you're wondering how the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and what they have to do with your relationship, keep watching, because there's some real implications for people who are in narcissistic marriage. So let's take this on. This idea of Gottman's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, very dramatic name, and the narcissistic relationship, because it does raise some issues that are specific in narcissistic marriages. Like I said, Dr. John Gottman is a renowned marital researcher who has studied thousands, probably tens of thousands of people who are married and coded these videos painstakingly to come to some major conclusions about what works in marriages. He trains thousands of therapists in his model of marital therapy. Maybe many of you have seen what's called a Gottman therapist. His data-driven approach to couples therapy is really, really steeped in science, and he has numerous adherents around the world, both therapists and clients. Gottman's research was done over many decades, and like I said, it's a really impressive body of work that has culminated in clinical applications that work for many, many people. Now, one of the big pieces to come out of, or big takeaways that's come out of Gottman's work, is he tries to understand sort of what predicts whether a marriage succeeds or doesn't stay together. And he brought out this idea, the concept of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And no, not the original 4. So there's a trivia question. Any of you know what the 4 original horsemen of the apocalypse are? They are conquest, war, hunger, and death. Those are not what we're going to be talking about here. In Gottman's work, the 4 horsemen are factors that he identified by research that would predict the end of a relationship. And that if these patterns are not addressed, then the relationship, on the basis of his data, is not likely to last, and is very strongly predicted that such a marriage would end in divorce. So where it gets really interesting to me, as somebody who's interested in narcissistic relationships, is that all 4 of Gottman's horsemen, as they were, are actually perfect descriptors of what happens in all narcissistic relationships. So bear with me, because here is the reasoning. If Gottman's research holds that relationships characterized by these 4 patterns don't last, and just about every narcissistic relationship is characterized by these 4 patterns, then perhaps no narcissistic relationship can last. So let's take a look at what these 4 horsemen are, so you could apply them to your relationships and think about what this really means. So let's start by talking about the 4 horsemen. The 4 horsemen are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. In fact, these factors pretty much describe narcissistic communication styles with everyone. So let's start with criticism. Criticism is just what it sounds like. Criticism. Now remember, Gottman's work is focused on marriage and intimate relationships, and I think his work is very much focused on marriage and divorce, but marriage. And specifically, though, his model is very focused on communication within marital relationships. So Gottman is basically observing how people talk to each other in an intimate relationship, in a marital relationship. And that's what his research is based on. The way they describe criticism in the Gottman model is that criticism is, in essence, going after someone's character. For example, in a relationship, if one person feels, I don't know, the other person's not doing their share of the chores, a criticism statement would be, "You're so lazy. What do you do all day? You don't get anything done. You never have." So that's criticism. It doesn't actually address the specific issue of the dishes are not done, okay? It doesn't feel good to be on the receiving end of that. And again, the focus isn't even on the undone dishes. It's about assailing the other person. And let's face it, criticism is pretty much the core of almost every narcissistic relationship. They'll say things like, "You never cared about me," instead of, "I had hoped you would call more often." Criticism is a chronic refrain of the narcissistic relationship. And then once you hear it for long enough, what ends up happening is the person always being criticized is at some point you start believing it. Defensiveness, horseman 2, is actually often a cycle that plays out for both people in a narcissistic relationship. Mostly because there is so much criticism. So in Gottman's model, criticism sets off defensiveness. When we feel attacked, we want to defend ourselves. It's an almost reflexive reaction, which is why it's so hard in narcissistic relationships, right? I tell you don't defend, you're like, "Oh, they're criticizing me, I want to defend." But with narcissists, defensiveness always makes things worse. Narcissists do this all the time, and it can often take the form of gaslighting. "I never said that. I never did that. That didn't happen." Or sometimes they try word salad. "I am tired of being told I don't care. I work hard. I make money. I plan vacations. I have stopped playing tennis as much, and I love tennis, and now I'm not playing tennis. It's like nobody in the family cares about my health. I was doing one thing for my health. I was playing tennis. And then if I play tennis, there's not going to be any money. And you're like, what just happened, right? Meanwhile, that entire word salad mess may have simply been launched by you asking them why they didn't pick up the milk and cat food on the way home because you needed it for that night. Narcissistic relationships are basically just defensive dances. You trying to, usually failing, but you defending yourself from accusations that often don't make sense or just never end, or criticisms that seem unrelenting, and them, the narcissist, constantly defending themselves to protect their fragility. Then there is horseman number 3, contempt. Contempt, very simply, is just being mean, but not just regular mean, dismissively, sneeringly mean. A person who shows contempt is almost disgusted by someone. Anyone in a narcissistic relationship has pretty much just experienced a masterclass on contempt. Narcissists get bored with people pretty easily. Narcissists are also often quite snobby. They can be dismissive and invalidating. And all of these things present as contempt. They may have contempt for your friends or your family. They may have contempt for the way you cook. They may have contempt for how you sneeze. Nothing is off limits. Contempt is about a sense of superiority, that somehow one person is doing more, is worth more, deserves more, and is somehow better than the other person. And needless to say, in the case of the narcissist, it's always that they think they deserve more. Contempt is also, though, a troubling two-way street in a narcissistic relationship. And it makes sense why this is the case. The narcissist often tends to be contemptuous of lots of people, including of their own partner. But since contempt can arise from the negative feelings that you have about a partner, you yourself, if you're in a narcissistic relationship, may find yourself developing contempt. And then you start feeling like you're the one who's narcissistic because you're having such negative, contemptuous feelings. Interestingly, Gottman found that contempt was the most consistent predictor of divorce. Then there is the next horseman, which is good old stonewalling. Stonewalling is a narcissist's go-to. Stonewalling can be things like, I refuse to talk about that, storming out of or leaving the room while you're speaking directly to them, the silent treatment, looking at their phone when you are talking. All of those are forms of stonewalling. Again, Gottman's assertion is that we are all guilty of doing these things at times. You yourself may have stonewalled too. I know I've stonewalled. I'm copping to it. We've probably all done it. And his argument actually about stonewalling is that when we are physiologically flooded, we don't respond and we shut down. And that's what he's giving as the reasoning behind stonewalling. Now, the nice thing is that Gottman's model doesn't just leave us hanging. His institute actually suggests antidotes to these patterns. But many of the things that he suggests as the antidotes do not work in a narcissistic relationship. They suggest that the antidote to criticism, for example, is to talk about your feelings with sentences that start with I, and to express a need positively. Sadly, I know this is something that many people were told when they went to couples therapy with a narcissistic partner. I tell people this, that you've got to take accountability, that you have to put feelings in terms of I. And when they used that technique with the narcissist, they were only met with contempt when they tried this. Can you imagine saying to a narcissist, I feel a little anxious and I just want to talk to you about my day? An antidote that they suggest to contempt is to build a culture of appreciation and reminding yourself of your partner's positive attributes. The difficult thing is that to do this, to create that culture of cooperation and ultra appreciating your partner when they're narcissistic, is that it can often run the risk of justification, of maintaining cognitive dissonance and strengthening the trauma bond. Again, this is guidance that many people in narcissistic relationships are given in couples therapy. Build gratitude for your partner. I have no doubt it works well when there are two non-antagonistic people in a relationship, and many times we get sloppy when we're in our relationships and we don't express enough gratitude. The idea of one person only expressing the gratitude, you, to the narcissist, over time isn't going to work. As an antidote to defensiveness, they suggest taking responsibility, which in their language means accepting your partner's point of view and apologizing for your wrongdoing. Once again, you can see how this antidote gets tricky, because if the narcissist's point of view is deeply skewed or self-serving, which tends to happen quite a bit in narcissistic relationships, what are you doing then when you accept their point of view again, in essence, kind of sign off on gaslighting at times, and concerns, and this sort of raises, again, to me, concerns about cognitive dissonance. Now, I am always going to be the first to say, take responsibility and own your behavior. No one is always going to get it right in a relationship. Just own it. But that technique only works if both parties in a relationship are doing it. Now, as the antidote to stonewalling, the people in this model, they suggest self-soothing, like taking a break. Now, the taking a break, the sort of getting yourself out of that situation, the issue is that that's meant for the stonewaller, not for the stonewall-e. Now, perhaps the narcissist will do this, and if your temptation is to march off, then there is some utility in this, right? But if the narcissist is the one who keeps stonewalling, they are unlikely to hear you when you point this pattern out to them. Now, I am actually, again, I am an admirer of the body of research that Gottman has produced and how it's gotten translated into clinical intervention. But, this is a big but, in the skewed and contorted world of narcissistic relationships, this guidance not only would leave many people in narcissistic relationships with no meaningful results or recourse or safety, it could actually make the abuse worse. The narcissist saying, hey, you don't express yourself positively enough. Isn't that what we just learned in therapy? Or you don't appreciate me enough. That's what we were told. Or you need to apologize to me. And the fact is that, and I read their materials carefully, at Gottman's Institute, they are definitely willing to recognize that some relationships are too toxic to save. And they do cite narcissistic personality disorder as one of the factors in that. But the challenge remains that because many, many therapists may not detect narcissism or narcissistic personality styles and patterns, they may just happily be suggesting antidotes and gratitude when the utility of that ship has left the harbor. Given that the majority of narcissistic relationships are characterized by these patterns, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, and sometimes these patterns are observed by both partners, and the antidotes being suggested for each of these patterns pretty much not working, then the unfortunate conclusion is that these relationships just really don't work. at least not in a healthy way. And it's tough to be a couples therapist, especially if you're using this model to be able to say, yeah, we're not going to be able to fix the car, we're not going to be able to fix the marriage. And this breakdown may explain some of the frustrations you experienced in couples therapy, because many models of couples therapy do not make sufficient allowances for unhealthy patterns like narcissism. And so when I read these materials, I was like, this is interesting. I've always known about the four horsemen model. And so when I noticed contempt in marital relationships, I'm like, yikes. But because so often the contempt, because of the nature of the work I do, the contempt in a marital relationship, that there's really no way of creating sort of a culture of appreciation or any of these other tools, you really do realize that it's not going to work. And sometimes clients will say that we've gone to couples therapy and it actually did make things far, far worse in the relationship, because the non-narcissistic partner was being told, you need to try to take their point of view, you need to express more gratitude. So do a deep dive on your relationship and go ahead and reflect, how many of the four horsemen do you have in your relationship? And although Gottman's research is focused on marriage, I do think that these constructs, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, these are unhealthy elements of any relationship. And you may say, it's interesting, I have a friend who's narcissistic, I have a boss who's narcissistic, I have a parent or a sibling who's narcissistic, and it's exactly the same kind of things that are happening. These patterns are manifesting in those relationships. So the very thing that pretty much speaks to what is likely the end of a relationship are some of the core characteristics of a narcissistic relationship. Now that's something to chew on. Thanks again for tuning in.